Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be talking about something that's been coming up more and more lately, and it's this idea of religious trauma,
Yeah,
specifically for millennials who have left Christianity. And
definitely a hot topic.
yeah, it is. And we've got this really interesting dissertation called Between Space that we're going to be looking at. Have you ever read a dissertation before?
I have actually.
Yeah.
It's not light reading, let me tell you.
No, they're pretty intense. But this one is actually full of some really powerful personal insights, and it's connecting those personal insights to these larger cultural shifts and philosophical ideas.
Yeah, it's not every day you get to see a dissertation as source material, right?
Right.
But what's really interesting about Between Space is how it takes those experiences and connects them to these larger things.
Exactly. Okay, so
Yeah.
let's jump right in. The dissertation makes this bold comparison between millennials leaving Christianity and the Copernican revolution.
hmm
So can you explain that a little bit more for our listeners?
Yeah, so picture Galileo back in the day, challenging the church's view that the Earth was the center of the universe, right? The Copernicans, with their heliocentric model, they really shook things up.
Yeah.
And the dissertation argues that millennials who are leaving the church are kind of like modern-day Copernicans.
Wow.
They are shifting away from that traditional absolute view of the church, and they're seeking a more personal understanding of spirituality.
So it's not just about leaving the church, it's about a fundamental shift in how they view spirituality.
Exactly.
Uh,
And the dissertation uses this really powerful image. It says, like the iceberg warning to the Titanic, it should not be ignored.
Ooh, that's powerful.
What's fascinating, too, is the author backs this up with statistics from Gallup showing this significant decline in church membership over the past 2 decades,
hmm
especially among millennials.
Yeah, the Barna Group research that we've looked at actually shows that the de-church are the fastest growing segment of the population.
That's wild.
Yeah, it really is. So what reasons does the dissertation give for why so many millennials are leaving?
One major reason is religious trauma.
Okay.
The author describes their own upbringing in a very specific type of Christianity that they call colonized Christianity.
Colonized Christianity. I'm curious about that.
Yeah, where obedience and conformity were paramount, and this led to feelings of being unseen and unheard, which really added to their sense of trauma.
Yeah, it's interesting because in talking with people who have left the church, in just casual conversation, I've heard similar stories from other millennials. Do you think this resonates with our listener at all?
I think so, for sure. I mean, the dissertation actually defines something called religious trauma syndrome, or RTS,
Okay.
based on Dr. Marlene Wanell's work.
Yeah.
And it describes the lasting effects of religious indoctrination and the trauma of breaking away.
So it's not just about leaving, it's the scars left behind.
Exactly.
Oh.
And the dissertation digs into how this trauma can show up from anxiety and guilt to even struggling to form healthy relationships. The author really emphasizes that religious trauma is a real condition that requires care and attention.
Yeah, it sounds like the author of this dissertation is trying to make sense of their own experiences while also shining a light on a much larger phenomenon.
Absolutely. And they do that through this creative approach called theopoetics.
Theopoetics, that's a new one.
Right. It's basically using a blend of poetry, theology, and personal narrative to explore religious trauma.
So instead of just like a traditional theological analysis, it's more about using creative expression to understand and process those difficult experiences.
Yes. And the author's clearly influenced by some pretty big names in theopoetics, like Reuben Alves. He's known for mixing poetry and prayer and mysticism with theology.
Wow.
I wonder if our listeners are familiar with Alves.
Yeah, for sure. So it's a very unique approach, for sure.
Mm.
One that really tries to capture those emotional and spiritual complexities of religious trauma. The dissertation also mentions that the author identifies as a shaman in journey. That's a pretty powerful statement. What does that mean in this context?
It really speaks to their own healing journey and their desire to help others. They actually cite Don Jose Ruiz, who defines a shaman as an awakened one. So it highlights this idea of awareness and seeing things from a different perspective.
It's not just about individual healing, but also about helping others who are going through something similar.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the dissertation really emphasizes this collective aspect of healing. It's about walking alongside others and offering support and guidance as they navigate their own paths.
And this leads us to the heart of the dissertation, which is this proposal for creating between spaces to help millennials heal from religious trauma.
Yeah.
And there are 3 specific initiatives that are outlined, right?
Yes. There's Public Space, which is an online community for dialogue and connection.
Okay.
Then there's Between Film, which are these online courses that use film analysis to explore these themes.
Oh, wow.
And finally, Safe Space, which provides this listening space for sharing experiences and receiving support.
So these spaces aim to address the needs of millennials who are looking for healing and community outside of traditional religious institutions.
Exactly.
I'm curious, before we dive deeper into those between spaces, what has stood out to you the most so far? What's resonating with you about the author's story and this concept of religious trauma?
Well, what resonates with me is how the author uses their personal experience to kind of highlight this broader trend. The dissertation actually dives deep into the data behind why so many millennials are leaving Christianity. Like, they cite statistics from Gallup showing that only 47% of U.S. citizens belong to a church, synagogue, or mosque in 2020.
Wow. So that's a significant drop from the 70% reported back in 1999.
Huge.
Yeah. So in just 2 decades, church membership has plummeted, especially among millennials. And the author actually uses the term migration to describe this phenomenon.
Right, there's like a mass exodus.
Yeah. What do you think they mean by migration?
Well, I think it suggests that this isn't just a phase. It's a major cultural shift. And it makes you wonder, like, where are all these millennials migrating to? What are they looking for outside of traditional religion?
That's a great question. The dissertation talks about the rise of the spiritual but not religious movement, or SBNR. What's your take on that?
Yeah, well, the author points to research suggesting that 2 out of 3 people in America claim to be spiritual, but half of them don't see a reason to go to church.
Wow.
So there's this yearning for something bigger than themselves, but they're not finding it in these traditional religious structures.
And I can see why the dissertation argues that organized religion, especially Christianity as it's often practiced in America, can feel very rigid and out of touch with the realities of many millennials' lives.
Yeah, I mean, it can definitely feel that way.
Do you think that rigidity is pushing people away?
I mean, it's definitely a factor for some. The author quotes sociologist Dr. Siobhan Chandler, who suggests that the SBNR movement kind of lets individuals bypass this negative baggage that's often associated with organized religion. That idea that it's stuffy and outdated or even harmful.
Right. And I think that makes sense. The dissertation also mentions that millennials are craving this freedom and autonomy to kind of create their own spiritual paths, drawing from various sources and not being confined by this strict dogma.
Yeah, they want to explore.
Yeah, so it seems like they're not rejecting spirituality altogether. They're just seeking something that's more personalized and meaningful for them.
Absolutely. And, it's not just about this individual exploration either. The dissertation also highlights the importance of community for those who have experienced religious trauma.
That's a good point.
Like, they quote Pastor Jimenez, who observed that churches often struggle to connect with people outside their own walls.
That's interesting.
And this can leave those who've left the church feeling isolated and disconnected.
It's almost like there's this gap
Yeah, a real disconnect.
between what people are seeking and what traditional institutions are offering. And it makes you wonder, how can we create communities that are truly welcoming and supportive, especially for those who are hurting?
Right. And that's where these between spaces come in. The dissertation describes them as being intentionally designed to provide that sense of belonging and support that so many millennials are seeking.
The dissertation also goes into some detail about the author's personal experiences with religious trauma. Can you remind us a bit about their background?
Sure. The author had a pretty difficult childhood marked by poverty and even homelessness.
Wow.
And they talk about how their specific Christian upbringing, which they call colonized, actually contributed to their trauma.
Oh.
Like, obedience was key, and any perceived disobedience was met with physical discipline, which really reinforced this idea that righteousness was tied to following the rules.
It sounds incredibly difficult for them.
It was.
Yeah.
And they actually share some specific examples of how this manifested in their life.
Oh, really? Like what?
Well, like, they described this sense of fear and anxiety that they felt, even around the image of Jesus, associating it with punishment and judgment.
Oh, wow.
They even go on to talk about interterrestrial trauma, which I think is such a powerful way to describe those unseen wounds left by religious trauma.
Interterrestrial trauma. Yeah, I've never heard that term before, but it's so evocative.
It is.
It speaks to those emotional and psychological scars that aren't always visible but can have such a profound impact on how someone views themselves and their relationship with spirituality.
Definitely.
So the dissertation really connects this to the broader idea of religious trauma syndrome, highlighting all those symptoms like anxiety, depression, guilt, shame, and even the difficulty forming healthy relationships as adults.
Yeah, it can really impact all areas of life.
Wow. So it really underscores that this is a serious issue with real consequences.
Mm.
It's not something to be dismissed or minimized.
Absolutely. And the dissertation even touches on the societal impact of religious trauma, arguing that it can contribute to things like fear and division and even violence.
It's much bigger than just the individual.
Exactly.
Wow. It's a really sobering thought. But it also speaks to the urgency of addressing this issue and creating spaces for healing and understanding.
Right. We need to be talking about this more.
Yeah. And then the dissertation shifts gears a bit and starts asking some very pointed research questions about the nature of community itself.
Yeah.
One of the key questions that they ask is, if the church is community, how has the church been modeled and who is this community modeled for?
That's a good question. It makes you think.
It really challenges us to examine those assumptions and those structures that underlie our traditional religious institutions.
Yeah, it does. And the dissertation goes on to explore various models of community, from traditional denominations to non-denominational churches and even online communities, acknowledging that the very concept of community is evolving.
And it seems like they're trying to understand how these different models of community can or cannot meet the needs of those experiencing religious trauma.
Exactly.
Yeah, and ultimately they argue that the most effective communities for healing are those that are safe and inclusive,
Huh.
authentic and vulnerable, open to dialogue and questioning, supportive of mental health and healing,
Yeah.
flexible and adaptable and focused on personal growth and self-discovery.
Yeah, it's about creating a space where people can truly be themselves.
That's a pretty comprehensive list. It seems like the author's really trying to create a blueprint for this new kind of community, one that's truly healing and empowering.
I think so. And it's not just about these external structures either. The dissertation also delves deep into this concept of the self, drawing heavily on the work of Carl Jung.
Oh, Jung is fascinating.
He is.
But his ideas about the self and the unconscious and this process of individuation can be pretty complex.
Again.
So how does the dissertation make those ideas accessible to someone who might not be familiar with Jungian psychology?
Well, they do a great job of connecting Jung's concepts to the experiences of millennials who've left the church. They highlight key aspects of the self, like its wholeness and its capacity for transcendence.
So they're showing how these ideas can be relevant for people who are looking for meaning and purpose outside of traditional religious frameworks.
Exactly. And they even use the analogy of a mandala, which Jung used to represent the self,
Oh, wow.
to illustrate this idea of wholeness and integration.
I love that visuals can be so powerful, especially when dealing with these abstract concepts.
They can. And the dissertation also discusses this process of individuation, which Jung saw as a journey toward wholeness.
Mm-hmm. So it's not just about rejecting religion, it's about embarking on this journey of self-discovery and integrating all the different parts of yourself.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, and the author makes a really strong case for how engaging with Jungian ideas can help millennials find that sense of wholeness and purpose outside of traditional religion.
I agree. And they're using some interesting tools to facilitate this journey, like things like film analysis and creative expression.
Right. And this brings us back to those 3 between spaces initiatives that the dissertation proposes.
Yeah.
Public space, between film, and safe space.
Exactly.
So let's talk about each of those in a little more detail.
Okay.
First up, public space. What exactly is that?
So public space is this online community where people can connect and share their experiences and engage in meaningful dialogue about religious trauma. And the author actually launched it back in February of 2023 on a platform called Mighty Networks.
Oh, wow. So it's interesting that they chose an online platform.
Yeah.
Do they talk about why that was important to them?
They do. They emphasize the importance of accessibility and creating this safe and inclusive environment where people can feel comfortable sharing their vulnerabilities. And they also talk about this role of a path maker in this community.
A path maker. That's a really interesting title. What do they mean by that?
Well, they describe a path maker as a leader who kind of guides others through this uncharted territory of religious transition.
So not dictating a specific path, but just helping people find their own way.
Exactly. And the path maker embodies this empathy and authenticity and a deep understanding of this meta-spiritual realm.
Sounds very supportive and non-judgmental, which I think is so important when dealing with something as sensitive as religious trauma.
For sure. And next up we have Between Film, which is this series of online courses that use film analysis to explore themes of religious trauma, personal growth, and spirituality.
Oh, wow. I love the idea of using film as a tool for exploration and healing. It feels very accessible and engaging.
Right. The dissertation even includes syllabuses for the courses, which cover topics like the shadow community and the hero's journey.
Wow, those are some pretty powerful themes. What kind of films do they use in these courses?
Well, they don't specify particular films in the dissertation, but they talk about using film as this sacred living text,
Okay.
suggesting that each individual is a text to be read and interpreted.
Oh, that's beautifully put. It really emphasizes the inherent value and complexity of every human being.
Right. And they even bring in the work of literary theorists like Paul Ricoeur and Michel Foucault to explore this idea of authorship and the meaning-making process.
Wow. They're really weaving together a lot of different threads here. It's a very interdisciplinary approach, which I think is so important when tackling complex issues like religious trauma.
Definitely. And finally, we have Safe Space, which is described as this listening space where individuals can share their experiences with religious trauma and receive empathetic support.
Okay, so it sounds like a very intimate and personal setting. How does the author facilitate these sessions?
Well, they offer individual sessions, both online and in person, and they emphasize the importance of active listening and creating a space where people feel truly heard and validated.
So the focus is on providing that unconditional support and understanding without trying to fix or advise.
Exactly. The author talks about the transformative power of simply holding space for someone, allowing them to share their story without judgment.
It sounds like they're really tapping into the power of storytelling as this form of healing and connection.
Yeah. And they highlight the importance of breaking down the stigma surrounding religious trauma by creating a space where people can talk openly and honestly.
This dissertation is so rich and insightful. It's clear that the author has poured their heart and soul into this work.
I agree. They've woven together their personal experiences, the academic research, and these innovative approaches to create something truly special.
Absolutely. What are your thoughts on how the author concludes the dissertation?
Well, they reflect on the challenges that they faced both personally and professionally as they kind of navigated this complex and emotionally charged topic.
It must have been quite a journey for them.
It was. And they also acknowledge the limitations of their research, recognizing that their findings are based on a small sample size and a specific demographic.
That's important to acknowledge, especially in academic research. But even with those limitations, they still make such a strong case for the importance of this work.
Definitely. They end with a powerful call to action, urging others to continue exploring these ideas and creating spaces for those who have been impacted by religious trauma.
It's a hopeful and inspiring message, reminding us that even amidst all the pain and disillusionment, there's always that possibility for growth, healing, and transformation. One thing that stood out to me was how the author brings in the work of Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educator and philosopher. Are you familiar with Freire at all?
Yeah, Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, a classic.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It's all about empowering learners to think critically and question assumptions and challenge those oppressive structures.
And the dissertation applies these ideas to the context of religious trauma, which makes sense, right? I mean, if you've grown up in this really strict religious environment, you might not have had many opportunities to actually develop those critical thinking skills.
Absolutely. And the author highlights Freire's concept of problem-posing education, where learners actually work together to identify and analyze problems in their own lives.
So it's not about being told what to think. It's about creating a space for dialogue and shared learning.
Exactly. And that can be so powerful for someone who's experiencing religious trauma.
It gives them the tools to kind of take ownership of their own experiences and understand those root causes of their pain. And Freire also talks about the importance of reflective praxis, which is this idea of taking action based on critical reflection. So it's not just about thinking about things, it's about putting those thoughts into action and making real changes in your life.
Yeah, taking those steps.
Yeah. And the author suggests that this can be a key part of healing from religious trauma, whether that's setting boundaries with family or finding a new spiritual community, or even advocating for change within religious institutions.
Like putting those reflections into practice.
Yeah, exactly. It's about moving beyond the pain and creating a life that feels authentic and fulfilling. And I think what the author has done with this dissertation is truly remarkable. They've woven together personal experience, academic research, and these innovative approaches to healing to create something really, really special.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's a testament to the power of vulnerability, creativity, and a deep commitment to helping others.
It really is. So we've covered so much in this deep dive. You know, we've gone from these personal stories of millennials leaving Christianity to the philosophical underpinnings of religious trauma, and even these really thought-provoking educational theories. It's a lot to take in.
It is.
What are your final thoughts?
I think what stands out to me is that there's no one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to healing from religious trauma.
Right.
But what this dissertation offers is a framework for understanding the complexities of this experience and exploring different paths toward healing and wholeness.
That's a perfect way to sum it up.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'd like to leave our listeners with a question to ponder. If traditional religious structures aren't working for everyone, what new paths to healing and spiritual growth might emerge in the 21st century? Could exploring films, engaging in online communities, or simply sharing our stories in safe spaces offer a way forward? What do you think?
Hmm. That's a great question. I think it's something we all need to be thinking about, and it's definitely a conversation that needs to continue.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.